I apologize now for moving it.
He actually spent several hours just
Shoot.
just doing it just right.
He's going to go back in and edit my stuff that we've recorded in the past now to make me look
Yeah.
bad.
Okay, Senator Mike Lee, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
And you've gone through cold rain and snow, and it's approaching a monsoon out there. And I warn our listeners and our viewers that if you hear a sound that sounds like a truck, it's just rain hitting this tin roof that was built around 1860 or something. So
We had snow in Utah earlier this week, and just about an hour ago I was with my colleagues in the Senate, and everybody's phones went off at once for the flash flood warning. So
yeah, and
severe weather happening all around.
It's 110 in Arizona, so it's weird out there.
Good times.
But we are gathering the day before Constitution Day, sort of. We're pretending that it's the day before Constitution Day. And we are talking about the premiere of a series that you have been working with us, Free the People, and also the Federalist Society. I think we've been working on it about a year now. It's been a little bit postponed because of COVID and all of the drama happening in 2020. But it seems like a completely appropriate time to talk about the Constitution and why it still matters. The series is called The Constitution Line by Line, and it stars you. And we figured that you were a good guy to do this because you've been marinating in the Constitution supposedly since you were in diapers. I don't know if that's exactly true, but you've been thinking about this stuff a long time.
Yeah, I mean, I like to say since I was in diapers. One might argue that since I was in utero, but that brings up a whole separate set of topics. Whether infants, before they're born, can hear and understand, I don't know.
But for you, you would sit around the dinner table with your dad and your family, and you would argue about things like Article 1.
Right. And, of course, every family in America does that, as they should. We certainly did that in my family. It was a rite of passage. It was something we enjoyed doing, and something I think every family ought to consider doing, simply because it reminds people of their place in the world. It reminds Americans of their relationship to their government. Perhaps most importantly, it reminds them that government isn't everything. Government is just the official collective use of coercive force. It's nothing more than that. And the Constitution consists of a set of rules about how official collective force may and may not be utilized.
A document of unique genius, I think you believe.
Yes, of unique genius, written by wise men who I believe were raised up by God to that very purpose. These were unusually gifted individuals who happened to be living on the same part of the same planet at the same time. We're very fortunate that they were brought together at that time in defense of liberty. They really, most of them, I think, had relatively little to gain from the revolutionary effort and then later from the constitutional effort, other than the fact that they wanted a land that would be better for their posterity. Certainly would have been easier for them, in many respects, for them to have come up with a different, more efficient system of government, and it probably would have inured to their political and financial benefit to have concentrated power more than they did. Instead, they dispersed it, which is exactly what needed to happen.
Yeah. I sort of pined for the days when our political leaders would put a little skin in the game, and in this case, they were putting their heads on the block.
Yes.
And I think few people that don't know the history appreciate that they were sacrificing everything, their property, their families, and potentially their lives if King George got a hold of them.
Yeah, absolutely. This was their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honor, and there was no exaggeration to say that. In those moments in particular, it would have been tempting to fall for what my wife and I have come to call emergency socialism, which is also known as socialism. I mean, anytime government exceeds its bounds and starts doing things that government can't do and government isn't supposed to do, it's always under the guise of an emergency. There is always an emergency that is at the heart of a drift in that direction. And that's why the Constitution's never been more important than it is right now.
Yeah. I mean, the emergency socialism thing, and I'm not going to ask you to name names, but it strikes me that based on my count, there's maybe a handful of senators and congressmen that haven't fallen for emergency socialism. And the thing that I heard years ago when I worked on the Hill is we just have to get through this election. Just if we can just sell out this once strategically, then next year we can do everything right.
That's right. That's right.
But as you point out in the series, particularly in the House of Representatives, they're always running for election, and the founders wanted it that way because they wanted the accountability.
That's right. It's just like St. Augustine during his conversion to Christianity, who famously uttered the prayer, Lord, grant me chastity, but not yet.
I want to go back because I want to establish your bona fides as a guy that really understands the Constitution, and we weren't really joking about the fact that in diapers you were learning about these things. Talk a little bit about your dad and how he instilled those constitutional values into you.
My dad was a man named Rex Lee. He grew up in a tiny town in St. John's, Arizona. Ended up going to law school. I went to the University of Chicago Law School and then clerked for Justice Byron White. Later in his career, after practicing as an attorney for a while, he ended up founding the law school at Brigham Young University. Later served as the Assistant Attorney General over the Civil Division in the Ford administration and the Solicitor General under the Reagan administration. Later in life, after that, he became the president of Brigham Young University. All along, he established and maintained a Supreme Court practice, having argued about 60 cases in front of the U.S. Supreme Court during his career. I was fortunate enough to have seen many of those. Started attending court with him when I was about 10. Originally as an effective way to miss school with the blessing of my parents.
I used to go to baseball instead. But
well, yeah. I mean, we went to baseball games too, but life wouldn't be complete without Supreme Court arguments.
And that always did bleed over to the dinner table, and you just thought it was normal to think about constitutional principles. Yeah,
I did. And, while I was growing up, my dad wrote several books. He was also a law professor and taught constitutional law. He wrote a book about the Equal Rights Amendment, and he dedicated that book to my mother and my grandmothers and all of my sisters. My brother and I complained that we weren't mentioned, and so he wrote another book called A Lawyer Looks at the Constitution, and he dedicated that to me and to my brother. And we both went into the family profession. It's not that we're particularly good at it, it's that we don't know how to do anything else.
So you really had no hope to be a normal person. You were going to be a lawyer instead.
Yeah, I mean, it's what people do. It's how you protect the Constitution, supposedly.
But you're not like most lawyers, right? You're different.
I'm one of the good lawyers.
Yeah, you're one of.
Look, there are as many kinds of lawyers as there are people. There are good ones. There are bad ones. There are those with great skill who are doing the wrong things, and there are those with skill who are doing the right things. I like to believe I'm doing the right things, and or regardless of what skill I possess at any given moment.
So, and the reason I'm digging deep and perhaps deeply offending you is that I want to establish that before you became a politician, you actually did constitutional lawyering. So
yep.
you went to law school and then you proceeded to do that work.
Yeah, I served as a law clerk at the U.S. Supreme Court, clerking for Justice Alito. I worked in appellate and Supreme Court litigation and worked on briefs on a wide variety of constitutional issues, everything from religious freedom to the Dormant Commerce Clause and everything in between. Made for a very interesting and rewarding career.
And I met you in 2010. I think it was 10. It wasn't 2009.
It was 2009 when we actually met the first time. Yeah.
And you were this wild-eyed constitutionalist that was driving around in a camper across the state of Utah, thinking that you were going to unseat a longtime, forever Republican senator. And at first I thought you were nuts, but then the more you talked, I'm like, I want to be nuts too.
Yeah, well, I remember coming in to visit you because I wasn't actually a candidate for the Senate at that point, but this was in the early fall or late summer of 2009. And I'd spent most of the year 2009 giving speeches about federalism and separation of powers around the state of Utah, a topic that I didn't really think would ever gain much popularity, but somehow inexplicably it did. And that movement to put on these speeches ended up morphing into a Senate campaign. And it was sort of during that transition period where I was thinking about running for the Senate that I came to pay a visit to you. I understood that my idea was a crazy one, and I think you might have been one of the first people I talked to who didn't throw me out of the room as a madman.
I assume someone said, go talk to Kibbe. He's crazy too.
Yeah, I think that's what happened.
Yeah.
They said, well, birds of a feather flock together, so go talk to this guy.
Always, one of my biggest regrets, and those were the heady days of the Tea Party when defending limited government and balanced budgets and the Constitution were popular. And one of my great regrets from the Tea Party days is so many activists would come up to me, and I'm sure you, and say, what should I be reading? I have this gut instinct that the government's gotten out of control and that we need to step up and defend our liberties, but I want to fill in the blanks. And we never got around to that part because I think perhaps wrongly we got too consumed by politics, and we didn't have time to sort of focus on the ideas. So in some ways, fast forward many years later, the series that we're doing is an attempt to right that wrong and make sure that every American has an opportunity to understand the basic architecture, the business plan of America and why it is such a great country. Because my fear, and perhaps yours, is that most people don't know this because they were never presented an opportunity in school to learn about the Constitution.
That's right. And the things that we're talking about in this series focus on the words themselves. The words themselves, nearly 2.5 centuries later, are still pretty easy to understand as long as you understand the context, as long as you understand how they've been interpreted, how they've been applied, how they were understood at the time. So that's why I think this conversation is so helpful and so important. These things, while once more commonly understood and while once widely taught in our school system in America, have now been neglected. People are instead being fed this narrative that suggests the job of the government is to make everything right or everything fair or everything equal somehow.
Safe is a popular thing right now.
Yeah, exactly. Because they're important things, and our job is to identify the important things and then handle them so that people feel safe. That really disregards the whole point. What's important for us to understand about the federal government is that it has limited powers. It's there only for a few purposes. It'd be an overstatement to say it's like a homeowners association with the military, but it would be closer to the truth than the current societal understanding seems to reflect. We would understand much better as a society why we're $27 trillion in debt and why we have a federal government that makes people work months out of every year just to pay their federal taxes, only to be told we're $27 trillion in debt. If people just had this basic understanding of what government's for, what the federal government specifically is for, and how the federal government is set up.
So last time you were on the show, which was well over a year ago, it's hard to measure time anymore since I've been holed up in my house under permanent lockdown. My tyrannical mayor is colluding with tyrannical governors to take any pretense of my freedoms away. But I've just gone down a rabbit hole that we can't go down.
Oh, we actually could. We could tie that into the Enclave Clause of Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, which is how we're going to take her power away. But we'll get to that another time.
We need to do a whole show about that because I'm feeling like a little revolution is appropriate here. But the last time you were on the show, you were talking about our Lost Declaration, which is, I believe, your most recent book.
Yes.
And the point there, which is probably relevant as we interpret the Constitution, is that the spirit, the ethos that shrouded the Constitution and enveloped the founders really is found in the Declaration, and that radically individualist, we're going to give power to the people and very stingily limit what government gets to do. That was such a profoundly different idea in our creation.
Yeah, it was a different idea than existed at the time. It's a different idea than exists now.
Yeah.
But it's the idea around which the entire Constitution is based. Sometimes I like to say that the picture frame is the Constitution. The Constitution is there to protect liberty, to protect our common shared belief system that there is immense value and eternal potential in the individual human soul, and that we as a society want to protect that from the abuses associated with the use of coercive force. And so to protect that, we came up with this Constitution. But the picture itself, what's being protected by the Constitution, is the Declaration of Independence.
So let's dig in. And this, I should say that this project, at least at this point, is focused on Article 1. We've partnered with the Federalist Society's project on Article 1. But there's a lot of pretty important stuff in Article 1, so I think that's okay. Article 1, Section 1 is the first episode of our series. And what do you think is most important there, and particularly when it comes to this, the regulatory state that has become, I don't think you use these words, but I feel like there's a fourth branch of government that we can't fire?
Mm-hmm. No, that's exactly right. In some ways, the most important part of the whole Constitution is the very first clause, Article 1, Section 1, Clause 1. All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. Those words mean a lot. They mean that insofar as federal law is appropriate, federal action is appropriate, the power to legislate, which means the power to establish the policy, the thou shalts of federal law, will be vested in a Congress. And that Congress is the branch of government most accountable to the people at the most regular intervals. You can fire every member of the House of Representatives every 2 years. You can fire 1/3 of the Senate every 2 years. That's why that power is and should be entrusted only to that branch of government, because it's the most accountable, because it happens to be the most dangerous power. We like to think of the three branches of government as being co-equal. And in theory, they are. In reality, the most dangerous branch by far is Congress. The framers understood that, and that's why they limited the power, and they limited the way in which that power could be exercised and the people entitled to exercise it. We violate that every time we outsource the task of lawmaking. The easiest way to think of this is if you and I were Congress, and you and I decided, we're tired of voters complaining about what the law says. So instead, we're just going to pass a law that grants somebody else the lawmaking power. So we pass a law that says, we shall have good law in America, and we hereby delegate the task of making additional laws to the herewith created American Commission for the Establishment of Good Laws, which will be vested with the power to make and interpret and enforce good laws in America. We would be off the hook. We would also be violating both the letter and the spirit of the Constitution, because we would no longer be accountable, even though we're the only people who can be held accountable for making laws in our system.
When do you think that, and maybe slippage started the day after the Constitution was enacted, but when did Congress really start abandoning their constitutional responsibility to write laws and create these vague mandates that unleash the bureaucratic hordes?
While there have been fits and starts throughout the history of our republic, there is no question in my mind that the biggest transformational era occurred in the 1930s. In other words, what exists today really was set in motion during the FDR administration, the New Deal era. Starting with the first term of Franklin D. Roosevelt, but really accelerating as we got into the early part of the second term of FDR. I trace a whole lot of this to a single moment, a single case decided by the Supreme Court on April 12, 1937, a case called the NLRB versus Jones and Laughlin Steel. In that case, the Supreme Court reinterpreted one provision of Article 1, Section 8, the Commerce Clause, broadly enough to give Congress the power to regulate just about any activity, as long as it was economic in nature. And once that happened, Congress had immense power, and power to regulate things that, previous to that point, had been the domain of the states. Labor, manufacturing, agriculture, mining, these are all economic activities that take place in one state at one time, typically. But all of a sudden, Congress had power to regulate anything within those areas that it wanted to. Congress panicked and said, we've got to start shifting this. So by the end of the 1930s, Congress was shifting to a very dramatic degree the lawmaking power through these vague laws, and it's continued to this very day, and that's a problem.
So it is, all of that is preceded, I believe, by the push by the progressive movement to make bureaucrats unfireable.
Yes.
And the vision was, and it's a very incredibly elitist vision, but the vision was, there are certain people who went to the right schools and came from the right families, and well, they're just smarter than the rest of us.
Experts.
So we need the experts. We need to put them in power and make sure they can't be fired by anybody.
Yeah.
And I think it's a wicked idea, and very contra the founders.
Right, absolutely, and it's also quite distinctively a Wilsonian idea. Woodrow Wilson was the first true academian American president, and he was an elitist. He was a racist, and he also believed strongly in the need for governing through experts. And while he was not as successful as Franklin D. Roosevelt would be a few administrations later, he sort of started to set this in motion. Interestingly enough, when Franklin D. Roosevelt was serving as governor of New York, he made a statement. I don't remember the quote exactly, but he uttered words to the effect that, as I look at forms of tyranny that have arisen throughout the world, I've concluded that if we ever encounter a type of tyranny in America, it will be a kind of soft, gentle, kind-appearing form of tyranny that will appear in the form of experts. Experts who will purport to have the ability to conceive of and remedy each problem because of their vast expertise. And they'll consolidate basically all power in the federal government and taking away power that would otherwise have been exercised at the state and local level. That is exactly how it turned out. Ironically, somewhat hypocritically under his leadership.
Yeah. I feel like particularly today, we are suffering under the pretense of knowledge from experts, particularly our healthcare experts within the federal government who make these sweeping statements as if they understand exactly what we're dealing with COVID-19. And clearly they don't, and any honest scientist would say we can't possibly know enough to decide all of these things, but they go ahead and do it anyway. And I think they know better, but they pretend that they know everything.
Yeah, and that's part of their shtick, pretending that they know everything, and on some level believing that they know everything, or at least that they know better than the unwashed masses, the peasants, meaning the American voters. Is part of how they do what they do. I mentioned earlier that the emergency is sort of the sine qua non of the drift toward socialism, at least in this country and probably in most countries. But there might be another head of that monster. It's sort of the two-headed hydra of the emergency and the expert.
Yeah.
You've got an emergency in the case of the New Deal era. The emergency was, of course, the Great Depression. And then you had a field of experts. We've got other emergencies today. The socialists and statists of every stripe, label, aroma, flavor are fond of identifying emergencies and experts. We've got a different set today, and it's accelerating us into that curve, which I find very distressing.
I feel like they've struck gold with people's genuine concerns about an unknown virus, but this is not a new phenomenon, and you've delineated all sorts of agencies and policies where the unelected bureaucracy has run amok. What do we do about it?
There's a surprisingly simple solution to all of this, and the simple solution can be found in a set of proposals that include reforms like the Reins Act. The Reins Act is an acronym that stands for Regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny. Rand Paul is the current lead sponsor of that legislation in the Senate. And the Reins Act simply says that anytime the federal administrative bureaucracy brings about a new rule imposing new economically significant obligations on the part of the public, as distinguished from something determining what time the lights go on in this or that federal agency, those are not self-executing, and they must be ratified by a majority vote in both houses of Congress, followed by a signature from the president. If we just passed that, that would get us back on the path toward following the Constitution, at least prospectively. We would start to gravitate back toward the constitutional norm. This would put the American people back in charge of making their own laws.
We've been picking on the unelected experts, but it strikes me that perhaps a majority in Congress doesn't want that responsibility back.
Yeah, and I should have made that clear to begin with. This is not really the fault of the bureaucrats. This is exactly what happens when you introduce them into the equation. So while I disagree with all sorts of things that the bureaucrats do from day to day, by and large, these are people who are, in fact, well-educated, well-intentioned, and hardworking, and they're trying to do a job that they were hired to do. They are not the source of the problem. We are, meaning the Congress of the United States is the problem. The problem that we have is that Congress, over time, members of Congress have seen, number one, our power has gotten so great that it's difficult to stay on top of all of it. But perhaps more importantly, and more significantly in recent years, members of Congress have identified a new holy grail. It used to be something else, the success, stability of the country, the economic strength and vitality of our communities and our nation. There is a new holy grail among members of Congress that seems to be longevity in office, perpetual reelection. And for purposes of that, outsourcing the power to an alphabet soup agency is perhaps exactly what they want, because it gives us complete deniability. If EPA or the Nuclear Regulatory Commission or the Securities Exchange Commission or any of the other alphabet soup agencies, they do something stupid, as they do from time to time because they're human beings, people come to us and complain, oh, look at what happened to me. Members of Congress are proud in that moment of beating their chests, saying angrily, oh, do you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to write them a harshly worded letter. That'll teach them. When we really are the problems, because at the heart of all of that is a set of laws that again and again and again has delegated this power to unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats. Shame on us.
One issue that this reminds me of an issue that you've been very outspoken on since the day you got to the U.S. Senate, and a continuingly horrible problem where Congress has refused to take back its constitutional responsibility to declare war. And you described that. I saw you once in a Senate hearing where you're describing like the great thing about this is that they can sort of do the opposite of what you just said. If when we're going to war, they can beat their chest and write appropriately vague legislation that's a blank check to the executive branch. And then when our men and women start dying, they can point fingers at the executive branch. It's disgusting.
It is. It's really nasty, and you're right to draw the parallel there. That's why there are multiple fixes that are needed for the broader problem, but they all stem back from the same origin, which is Congress voluntarily relinquishing Congress's authority, whether it's in regulatory power, in war power, in trade restriction power, power to adopt tariffs and things like that. These are all examples of where we've handed it over. In the war power area, the consequences can be particularly dire. There are reasons why this power, the power to declare war, was given only to Congress, and they relate to the same reason why we were given exclusive power to legislate, and that is because this is where a lot of damage can occur. Alexander Hamilton, in Federalist 69, I believe it was, explained that this was a key differentiation between the old system in our old country, the London-based government that we had prior to the Revolution, and the one that we have now. That is, the monarch under that system had the prerogative to declare war, to take the country to war. It was then up to Parliament to figure out how to pay for it. But the monarch got to decide when, where, whether to go to war. In our system, the system established under the Constitution, as Hamilton explained in Federalist 69, that power would have to be exercised from the first instance by the legislative branch. And this, he explained, would be absolutely necessary in a republic like ours.
There is, fast forward to just this week, there is a new indication that President Trump is promising to withdraw troops from Iraq and perhaps Afghanistan as well. I'll ask you the question that I asked Senator Rand Paul a couple weeks ago. For all of the president's rhetoric, why aren't we out of Afghanistan and Iraq?
He's up against a very real, formidable foe that exists within the, I don't know a better way to put it other than describing it the way Dwight Eisenhower referred to it as the military-industrial complex. This is an intimidating force that has brought many presidents to their knees and has stopped many presidents from getting out of wars and started a whole lot more wars. But to his credit, this president actually means it. This president is actually taking steps to get us out of those wars. He's committed to me that he's going to get us out of Afghanistan. I believe he's going to get us out of Iraq as well. Look, say what they might about him. His critics ultimately can't refute and have yet to refute the statement that I've been making of him, which is that Donald Trump is the least hawkish president who has served during my lifetime, by far. He has taken affirmative steps to end wars that we've been involved in, and he has not gotten us into war that I think most, if not all, modern presidents would have taken us into over the last 4 years. And that is significant. War is sort of the, it's bad for many, many reasons. It's fraught with all sorts of moral peril. It results in death, in suffering that is unlike anything else we know in this lifetime. And in addition to all of that, it expands government inexorably. It's a one-way ratchet. There was a Professor Porter at Harvard about 25, 30 years ago who wrote a book called War and the Rise of the State. And his theory is that governments grow when there is war, and they don't ever completely recede from the high watermark established by their most recent war.
Let's move to Article 1, Section 2, and this would be Episode 2. Conveniently, each episode is a section. I think we're going to stick with that model. There, you talk about a fundamental flaw in Section 2, Article 1, when the authors defined certain people as less than a person, unfree people, slaves. Talk about that.
The 3/5 compromise, the 3/5 provision in Article 1, Section 2 is something we find utterly repugnant because human beings are people and as such should be entitled, always have been entitled, but were not entitled under the text of the original Constitution to treatment as individual human beings. The 3/5 compromise was a really yucky compromise that was achieved in order to make some headway toward getting the Constitution ratified and toward counting to a degree for purposes of congressional representation those people who were in a state of slavery at the time. The interesting thing about that is that we tend to focus when we discuss it on the fact that they were counted as only 3/5 of a person. In some ways, what was most reprehensible was that they counted at all for purposes of representation when these same states were not treating them as people and not giving them the right to vote. And so that's why there's something of a paradox in there. There's also a paradox in it in that the 3/5 compromise in some ways planted the seeds toward what inevitably became the liberation movement, the movement that would result in the end of slavery for this country. And so you hear a lot of constitutional scholars and historians arguing, in some cases trying to outdo each other in terms of explaining how they wouldn't have signed the original Constitution because of the 3/5 clause. Now, I understand the argument completely, and they raise a point. The fact that it didn't outlaw slavery itself was a grave disappointment to many of the Constitution's firmest advocates, some of whom, by the way, were slave owners themselves. And yet, they did succeed ultimately in abolishing this institution. I'm not sure they could have gotten there, at least with the same degree of speed that they did, had they not ratified the Constitution.
And it goes back to your point about the Declaration of Independence, that document, that radical defense of the individual, ultimately demanded that be fixed.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The recognition that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That was embedded within the zeitgeist of the American people. That was part of what we embraced and understood. That language, in turn, was, I believe, based on language taken from something called the Sheffield Declaration, that recognized some of these Scottish Enlightenment ideals about the universal fundamental equality of human beings. That helped lead us in that direction. We understood that at the time we embraced the Declaration of Independence. We didn't succeed in getting rid of slavery at the time of the drafting and ratification of the Constitution, but we set in motion what would.
So what do you say to people, and I think the key is in that Scottish Enlightenment insight, radical insight, that people matter, individuals matter. But what do you say to people who, I'm thinking about Black Lives Matter and the protest today, which has morphed into, for some people, a fundamental critique of the American system, America's founding, and capitalism itself. What do you say to them?
Well, first of all, there are legitimate points that need to be made about our criminal justice system, things that really are rooted in liberty, and the fact that the government exists for the purpose of protecting life, liberty, and property, and nowhere is your life, liberty, and property more potentially threatened than when government steps in, puts you in handcuffs, takes you away, and subjects you to harsh treatment of various degrees. So we always need to be looking to reform that system because it's riddled with opportunities for abuse.
Abuse of government power.
Yeah, abuse of government power, and that almost always ends up getting exercised by government against those who are not among the most wealthy and well-connected in society, among America's poor and middle class. That is inevitably the way things turn out. And so I completely agree that we should always be looking to reform that system. And it's bad anytime that system is used in a way that's abusive, either along racial lines, as it has been on many occasions in this country throughout its history, or whether it's on procedural grounds, or whether our laws are put in place without adequate inquiry into what good they're doing. Insofar as this argument is morphed into an anti-capitalism rant, I don't see what good that does. In fact, an anti-capitalism rant, insofar as it can be understood as a pro-government rant, could have the opposite of the effect that we want. We don't want more government. We don't want more official coercive force, which is all government is. What we want is for individuals to be free. Don't hurt people and don't take their stuff. As someone I admire once wrote in a book.
It's that is sort of the contradiction, and I think about Bernie, who, I don't know if you've worked with him directly on criminal justice. I know you've worked with him on war powers, and a Bernie stump speech would rail about mass incarceration, would rail about permanent war, And by the end of it, he said that's why we need to expand government. So there's sort of that cognitive disconnect there, because the police brutality comes from unrestrained government power.
Yes.
By definition.
Yes.
And I don't quite understand why this isn't a teachable moment as to why we should actually embrace the Constitution, embrace limits and on government power, and I think we need to get at that. But the tragedy of shifting from real abuses in the criminal justice system, which are clearly there, and you've been a leader on this, to let's abolish capitalism, squandered, I think, an opportunity to force both Republicans and Democrats to do something about the system.
Yeah, exactly. And that idea is not lost on me, and this is an idea that I routinely bring up with my progressive colleagues, including Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
I thank him from time to time for being a conservative / libertarian when it comes to war power, criminal justice reform, things like that. In response, in part, to a TV interview that Bernie Sanders and I were doing together one time, he was getting mic'd up 10 seconds before we went on. He turned to me and he said, "Anything to be on TV with a fellow progressive." But look, his ideals.
Your opponent's going to use that in your next election.
Sure,
right?
sure.
Yeah.
And look, I don't care what label you attach to it. If it's pro-freedom, if it's in favor of restraining the power of government to erode liberty and to take life and property, we should be all for that.
Yeah, it doesn't really divide between red and blue. It's about whether or not you believe in human dignity or
Right.
you believe in government power.
Right. Most relevant to our time, it's about Washington, D.C. versus everyone else in America, really more than it is about red versus blue.
And we didn't talk about this part of your history, but you've been a leader on criminal justice reform, and that came from your experience as being on the other side of the fence.
Yes, I was a prosecutor, and while I was a prosecutor, I became aware of some instances in which our laws made no sense. Like when I saw the young man named Weldon Angelos sent away to prison on a minimum mandatory sentence.
He's going to be on the show soon.
Oh, Weldon's going to be on the
Yeah.
show? That's
Yeah.
fantastic. I love Weldon. He miraculously is out of prison now. But Weldon Angelos' story is one of the things that got me interested in criminal justice reform. When the judge sentenced him to 55 years, and he talked about how wrong it was, but he had no choice. He said, only Congress can fix this problem. And nearly a decade later, when I found myself in the Senate, I remembered that, and I got to work.
It strikes me as an obviously good political issue to take on this system, but you've been sort of lonely in this fight. There are plenty of Republicans and plenty of Democrats, including the candidate for president, who was the architect of mandatory minimums and mass incarceration. What's the contradiction there?
It's interesting. For a long time, I've been working on this nearly the entire time I've been in the Senate, which is nearly a decade now. For a long time, it was a very lonely battle. It was me and a bunch of progressives. Little by little, we would pick up Republicans here and there. Rand Paul, of course, was a big fan of it, and we had him from the beginning. But other than Rand and myself, it was the two of us and a bunch of Democrats for quite a while. Little by little, we gained momentum. We started picking off Republicans one at a time. And when we passed the First Step Act, we ended up with 87 votes in favor of it. Now, there's still a lot more to be done. And it's still not easy to gain momentum on it where it doesn't exist, because there's no massive fundraising potential from this. There is not a lot of big corporate interests who are in love with the idea of criminal justice reform. But it resonates on a very personal level. For those people to whom it matters deeply. And for those who value liberty, it should mean the world. And that's why I pursue it.
Yeah. So when we were filming the third episode, Article 1, Section 3, we had a conversation off camera, which I wish it would have been on camera, but we're about to put it on camera. And now you're anxious because you don't know what we were talking about. But you made what I thought was a really profound point about impeachment, and that the impeachment process is in this section of the Constitution, that there has been an escalation of attempts to impeach a president as the president and the powers of the executive have become completely unleashed and unfettered, to the point where the political parties say, if we don't have the presidency, we have nothing, which is contra everything that Article 1 lays out. Do you remember this conversation?
Yes.
Yeah, let's talk about this, because people need to understand this, and I think, at least in part, explains the proceedings against President Trump. But I think it not just him.
Yeah, it's not just him. It won't be the last, and I think it will continue to escalate as long as we continue our march toward concentrating more and more power in the federal government and in the executive branch in particular. Too much of who we are as a country, too much of our national identity has been bound up, along with this shift of power to Washington and within Washington to the executive branch. Too much of how we envision ourselves is now bound up in the presidency. That's why people lose their minds over presidential elections. That's why, a couple of weeks ago, Rand and Kelly Paul were with me and my wife Sharon as we were trying to leave the White House. It took us about an hour and a half to make it across the street to where we were heading. But for the fact that we took slightly different approaches to our destination, Sharon and I would have been with Rand and Kelly when they ran into this mob. But if you look at that mob and how horribly they treated Rand and Kelly, you have to ask yourself, what were they doing? What was it that got them so wound up that they were willing to attack the nicest, sweetest couple anybody could ever know in Rand and Kelly Paul?
With the possible exception of Mike and Sharon Lee.
Yes, obviously. I'm sure we're a distant second, but we have shifted so much power to the presidency that people feel like they can't exist without it. They can't define themselves without it. They can't survive without it. And that's why it's become so emotional. And that's why it's resulted in the abuse of the impeachment remedy. More things like this will continue to happen until such time as we get the balance restored and as we return the lawmaking power to the legislative branch. That's going to be hard. No one will resist that more than members of Congress themselves.
Yeah. That crowd would have done the same thing to you guys with the same irony of shouting at you about Say Her Name. Rand Paul, of course, was the author of the Justice for Breonna Taylor Act. Either they didn't know it or they didn't care, because the only thing that mattered was that guy was a Republican and Republicans are bad and we need to take those guys out, to your point about everything is wrapped up in not just political identity, but political power.
Yes.
We got to do something about that.
Factions, it's why the whole constitutional system was designed so as to create a balance not only among and between governments and among and between the three branches of the federal government, but also just among factions generally in society. When you shift power in the way that they did and you distribute it in a way that they did, it keeps things from reaching this crescendo level where it results in violence directed toward a single centralized power. And so predictably, our drift away from that has led to this.
And my favorite Mike Lee speech is a speech you gave to the Federalist Society. I think I bring it up every time that I talk to you, but it's to that point that federalism and the idea that we wouldn't centralize everything in one place is really the only way that diverse and different people of different backgrounds and different parents and different religions and different preferences, the genius of America is that we all got along. And as we centralize that, and 51% of the public think it's their right to impose their preferences on everybody else, that's a recipe for disaster. It's a recipe for violence.
It is indeed, because people feel differently in different parts of the country. Federalism and the Constitution itself really best exemplify our commitment to diversity in America, to regional ideological differences and local preferences the founders understood that these differences would exist. The fact that, today most of the people in Vermont would prefer to have a single-payer, government-run, government-funded healthcare system. Most of the people in Utah wouldn't. If the federal government weren't occupying such a significant portion of the entire economy, including the healthcare sector, you'd have more Utahns and more Vermonters getting more of what they want and less of what they don't want. That's why federalism is so important, and that's why I couldn't have been more proud when my daughter Eliza was coming out of having her wisdom teeth extracted and coming out of general anesthesia. Turns out she's a happy drunk. That's one way you can tell when a Mormon is a happy drunk or a sad drunk, is when they get their wisdom teeth out. Her first words she uttered were, "Mom and Dad, I love you. You're the best." And then she said, "And I love federalism, and I love separation of powers." I teared up. It was my proudest moment ever as a father.
So you're really corrupting your children much like your parents corrupted you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You have to corrupt them early and often, and it works.
And our job with this series, this is a nice way to wrap this up. Our aspiration in life is to corrupt every American with these beautiful ideas in the Constitution. Because I'll take it a step further. I love factions, but when I really parse it down, and maybe it's just because I'm a weirdo libertarian, I like factions of one, because I have this theory that we're all a little bit different. We're all beautiful in our own way. We all have our strengths and weaknesses, and it's the freedom to pursue those things that makes for the sort of purpose and dignity that I think makes life worth living. And it requires our government perhaps to read this document, or better yet, it requires the American people to understand this document and demand that Washington follow those rules.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I couldn't have said it better myself. And that was the whole point. The discussion of factions in Federalist 15 was not to say that factions are bad. Factions are good. And in any event, factions are a part of any society, especially any free society. We want them. The way that we make sure that we maintain harmony is to make sure that no one faction or group thereof can gain control of the whole of government, because government is the official use of coercive force, and it's dangerous, needs to be held under control.
So the Constitution Line by Line premieres tomorrow. We're excited about this. The project with Free the People, the Federalist Society, starring the one and only Senator Mike Lee from Utah. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching Kibbe on Liberty. By now, you know this is the most important event of your week. So make sure you subscribe on YouTube. Click the little bell so you get notifications. Kibbe on Liberty, mostly honest conversations with mostly interesting people.